welcome. I hope everyone enjoyed those tunes as we're getting ready for this webinar. Oh my gosh. I see we got Mississippi, we got Florida, we got North Carolina. All right, you guys, let's show up. I'm loving this energy. Oh my gosh, this is great. So we are so thankful for you guys coming out tonight and joining us on our Operation Dixie webinar. Oh my God, it's so great to see everybody. All right, so we're gonna start to get started just to keep up with time and keep up with everyone tonight. We're gonna go ahead and get started. Thank you all for coming, for showing up. I know some people are getting off work, some people picking up children. If you have any, yes, thank you for jumping on with us. I just wanna give you guys a little background. If some of you guys are familiar with the Southern Workers Assembly, and for those of you who are not familiar with the Southern Workers Assembly. So the purpose of our assembly is pretty much we try and organize rank and file workers to achieve a level of worker power through building organization in all kinds of workplaces. We want to unite them in assemblies and exercise sufficient power through collective bargaining contracts. With employers, we do workplace mobilizations, labor, and community solidarity. We really want people to be able to, go and speak with their higher powers and managers and representatives and talk with them about what they want done in their workplaces. Because as we know, this is a very tough year for us, for a lot of workers and just people across the United States all over. We're aiming to build an infrastructure of workplace organizations from which will emerge a powerful social movement that's able to win immediate economic and social improvements throughout all of the United States and for everyone, because we're all in this together and we're trying to keep this movement going. We believe this is the path towards a happier, fairer, and more democratic nation and a vital component for international worker solidarity capable of confronting the forces of domestic and global capitalism. So we want you guys to be able to speak with us tonight about what your concerns are. We have two incredible speakers for tonight, and I'll introduce them in just a moment. We want to hear from you guys just as much as we want you guys to listen to them. So without further ado, I want to introduce you to Ed Bruno. He is going to be one of our presenters tonight. So I'm hoping you guys are ready to listen and hear some interesting facts and some information that is going to help us along this journey that we have coming up with the Southern Workers Assembly. So I will pass it off to Ed.
Thank you, Sharon. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Ed Bruno. I'm a retired union organizer, and I'm speaking to you from Tampa, Florida. We thought we'd start the program tonight not talking about Operation Dixie, but in fact talking about what led to the upsurge of the CIO in 1936, 1937. This is a subject that we could spend all night talking about, and we spend a lot of time in Southern Workers Assembly talking about this because we think there's some wonderful lessons about how to organize what we call sweep organizing. In other words, more than one place, more than one labor board election, but actually big hunks of a company or big hunks of an industry. So we could spend a lot of time with this, but we're going to spend about 5 minutes. And the reason is to give you a little baseline so that you can compare the CIO upsurge with the Operation Dixie, which was really only 9 years later. So this is all in the same period of time. We also have an ulterior motive that we would like to encourage those of you who are young workplace organizers. We'd like to encourage you to have big plans, have ambitious plans, have bold strategy. And don't nibble around the edges. Don't be satisfied with that. Talk about big, broad sweeps. And that is, in fact, the spirit that built the CIO and later on built the public sector unions in those states where they exist. And also, by the way, built the civil rights movement, particularly the Birmingham campaign. So transport yourself. It's late 1936, 1937. The Depression's been going on since 1929. The breakthrough has yet to come. It's a little bit in our future yet. There are 5 elements, 5 factors that came together in a very particular way that led to industrial unionism. We want to talk about each one of these just for a second or two. Some of them, it's really a matter of luck and timing. Some of them was a matter of planning and strategy. And we'll pick through which was which in a moment. The first one was probably the most essential thing. It's hard to believe that there would be any breakthrough at any type without the first element. The first element is that there was a committed core, a cadre that pre-existed the breakthrough in almost every major industrial setting in the United States of America, certainly in the Midwest and the Northeast. This committed core was small, it was young, but it magnified its power by being in a network. So it joined up together. It might be by industry, it might be by geography, it might be by corporation. In many cases, it was by political party, particularly the Communist Party and the Socialist Party. But it was cores that were not isolated, but they existed in, let's say, all the big auto plants. And they were comparing notes. And they were doing stuff. They weren't just sitting there waiting for the union to show up. They were active on the shop floor. And they were failing time after time after time. Almost every strike from 1929 to 1937 was a failed strike, with the exception of a couple of general strikes. So this is the key essential point that we are making. Without those cores and without their network, it's hard to imagine any kind of sweet breakthrough. So the second element is the presence of a militant minority. Now, this was a group of workers numbered in the thousands, but very, very much a minority in all of the industry that were recruited specifically to take action. So these were people that were fed up. They were ready to do something. And they were recruited to do that. And so that this, again, was constant confronting of corporate power, and usually in strikes, public demonstrations, picket lines, and so forth. Very important. You wouldn't have the militant minority if you didn't have the committed core. The other three are much more objective condition questions. There was a high degree of class politics. Remember, 1936 was when Roosevelt was reelected. He swept almost all of the country with New Deal governors, New Deal senators. That's the election that we'd like to quote Roosevelt the most at, right? He talks about the economic royalists and so forth and so on. But workers were engaged in the politics of the day, and the politics of the day, because they were so strong with class content, gave workers the confidence that change could come and that they had an ability to finally make some gains in their workplace. At the same time, we had the beginning of new rights that were coming into existence through federal legislation. Sometimes we make a little light of the value of, it's not legalistic, this really is basic fundamental rights. So Norris-LaGuardia Act was passed in 1932. You had the Wagner Act passed in 35. It didn't become constitutional till after the breakthrough. But you had an awful lot of turmoil in the country. Rights always followed conflict, chaos, strikes, demonstrations, and then it pushed the question of establishing new rights. Lastly, but essential, was it developed a national voice for the new industrial unions. John L. Lewis. A more recent example is think about the civil rights movement. If the civil rights movement didn't have Martin Luther King or his equivalent, there would be probably no civil rights movement. Same thing is true if it didn't have Lyndon Johnson, there probably wouldn't have been any legislation. Here too, we find an ability to make a workplace issue outside of work in the public domain to be a major factor in the politics of the country. So those 5 elements came together in a very particular place in a very particular time. in Flint, Michigan, at the General Motors, huge complex of General Motors works, sometimes numbering as big as 40,000 people. So we have all the elements present. It's late 1936. There's a committed core, and this is all drawn from firsthand interviews by the people that were involved. We have a committed core of 6. Imagine that, 6 people, 40,000 people in the place. The 6 they were all men. The 6 had 40 key men that they called key men that they had spread out throughout the works in different key places. On top of that, the organizer that was assigned by the Communist Party to Flint had a mailing list of about 2,000 to 3,000 workers that he sent out. He and his wife, at their kitchen table, would put together a weekly mailing. Of course, there was no internet or anything, and mail it out to a couple thousand workers. That constituted the level of organization at this time in Flint, very small. They were networked together, however. So the men talked about, they had the sit-down strike already planned. They talked to people in Europe. They talked to rubber workers. They talked to what became the UE, who had a sit-down strike and a failed sit-down strike in RCA. So they had it all planned. They knew where they were going to sit down. They knew what pieces of the works they were going to take over. They had national leadership on location. John L. Lewis was in a hotel room in Flint and was encouraging the young cadre to be militant, not to compromise, not to do what they're going to need to do and not give the plant up. You had the new rights coming into focus. They became very important. Norris LaGuardia Act was passed in 1932. That outlawed federal injunctions, which meant that the federal troops would not show up. The plan was to have the sit down in 1937 after the New Deal governor of Michigan took office, a fellow by the name of Frank Murphy. A grievance arose in one of the factories, and people sat down to solve the grievance. The 6 guys got together and they prearranged spot and decided to have the sit down right then, a little bit before the New Deal governor took office. However, they were right to think that the New Deal governor, once he took office, did not call out the National Guard nor the state police. So the only question that had to be handled was the Flint Police Department. This is where the network came in, particularly into play. So they drew on the Ruther brothers who were down in Detroit. There was a whole network of people who came. So there's a combination of mass picketing with a unrelenting sit-down strike, eventually led to limited union recognition for what became the UAW and the General Motors Corporation, followed by limited union recognition by General Electric for the brand new union, the UE. And I'm going to close this story just by pointing out this kind of union recognition was as follows. The corporation recognized the union for its members in the locations where the union had members for the purposes of grievance resolution. So that's what it took to get that sort of an agreement. And then the unions perfected themselves from that point forward. So these 5 elements become crucial for organizers to have in your head and compare your situation with that situation. You're not going to have the same. The history will not repeat itself. But these elements are important. Their absence is just as important as their presence, and your ability to try to create those elements is crucial. So telescope yourself from 1937 to 1946, just 9 years later. We're going to move from Tampa, Florida up to North Carolina and pass this over to Jim Wren, who's a longtime rank and file leader of the UE in a place called Consolidated Diesel Cummins Engine. You're on, Jim.
Okay, hello, everybody. Glad everybody's on tonight. My name is Jim Wren. I'm, as he said, retired worker from the Cummins Rocky Mountain Engine Plant, where I was also the leader of the Carolina Auto Aerospace Machine Workers chapter of statewide UE Local 150. and also the Vice President of the Phoenix Historical Society, African American History of Edgecombe County, North Carolina. Beginning in 1946, the CIO launched its heralded Operation Dixie, designed to repeat in the South the CIO's industrial union organizing success in the North during the late 1930s. Certainly the CIO's pre-war and war era progress organizing industrial workers in and around Memphis, Tennessee, Birmingham, Alabama, and Piedmont, North Carolina gave CIO leaders reason to expect success. The CIO's Textile Workers Union of America, TWA, scored its biggest NRB election victory in 1942 at the Dan River Mills in Danville, Virginia. Between 1942 and 1945, TWA had won 436 contracts covering 100,000 workers in the South, what historian Timothy Minchin calls unprecedented rate of organizing. Needless to say, this was facilitated by the Depression-era conditions and working class solidarity coming out of the 1930s, as well as the role of the National War Labor Board that protected workers' union rights and imposed contracts on companies during World War II. CIO leadership chose to focus Operation Dixie on textile workers as the key organizing Southern industry.
Mm-hmm.
However, textile companies employed mostly white workers. The leadership of the CIO's Southern Organizing Committee, SOC, made several fateful decisions. Number one, purge leftist organizers from the organizing staff, avoid confrontation with racial segregation, and disaffiliate with the CIO's own Political Action Committee. Instead, the SOC staffed the textile campaign with outside Northern organizers not embedded in the community. Also in 1946, there was no more War Labor Board to protect union rights, and the post-war rising wages acting as a curb on unionization among white workers. In addition, a corporate ideological campaign tied to evangelical religion, linking unions with communism, racial integration, deterred white textile workers. With massive union resources poured into the organizing textile concentrations of Cannon Mills in North Carolina, Bibb in Georgia, and Avondale Mills in Alabama, at the end of the 6 months, the TWA had not received enough cards signed, 30%, to even petition for elections at any of these plants. Organizers complained about the power of textile owner paternalism over workers in the mill villages like Charlie Cannon over his 21 mills and 24,000 workers in and around his coming town of Kannapolis, North Carolina. According to historian Barbara Griffith, CIO organizers faced a choice in textiles of a large campaign against all plants in a given chain up against this kind of paternalistic power, or a small plant agenda, first organizing small plants one at a time before a major campaign on what was called the bellwether chains. This did not work. Griffith explained that the small plant strategy had no transforming event that could break down fear and inspire Southern workers, in particular white workers, with a vision of a better future with the union. A victory at a small plant was just a victory at a small plant. Operation Dixie has been described as a failure due to its lack of success in a breakthrough organization of white textile workers in the South. On the other hand, Operation Dixie did succeed, where it focused on Black workers, took up political challenges to segregation and the denial of Black voting rights, have relied on leftist and grassroots organizers with roots in the community, in particular the Black community. Examples include tobacco workers through the Food, Tobacco, and Agricultural Workers, CIO, lumber workers through the International Woodworkers of America, furniture workers through the United Furniture Workers of America, and the United Packing House Workers of America. All these were left-led unions with a focus on Black workers. Operation Dixie succeeded where unions employed what historians Michael Honey and Robert Korsdad call civil rights unionism, a political approach consciously avoided by the SOC leaders of the textile drive. The history of the FTA in North Carolina is the case in point. Originally named UCAPAWA, United Cannery Agricultural Packing and Allied Workers of America, with roots in Memphis and Alabama, Yucca organizers, and again, some of whom were members of the Communist Party, bored in for several years at the R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Complex in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. This laid the groundwork for the spontaneous June 1943 sit-down strike when 1,600 Black women workers stopped work to protest of harsh treatment and the death of a young co-worker in the plant. This was a transformative event that led to the organization of Local 22 and the first contract with the tobacco giant, a union of 10,000 workers. Subsequently linked to organization and the strike at several independent leaf houses in Winston-Salem. This was a big deal. This was probably the most important, one of the two most important Black workers' strikes in Southern history in the 20th century, let me put it that way. Yucca changed its name to the FTA to highlight tobacco. And in 1946, FTA joined in CIO's Operation Dixie with a campaign to organize leaf house workers in 10 eastern North Carolina cities. Local 22 dispatched rank and file organizers from Winston-Salem to fan out across the region, embed the Black community, and targeting 30 to 40 plants, signing up members at a $1 initiation fee. Workers joined the union up front, not just joining after an election and a contract was won. In competition with the FTA-CIO, the AFL launches a rival campaign in East North Carolina through their Tobacco Workers International Union. The AFL positioned itself as the less radical alternative and sought to negotiate sweetheart contracts with companies ahead of the CIO. But the AFL was only following the momentum of the CIO campaign. While the AFL union used staff organizers, the FTA sent rank and file worker organizers from Winston-Salem to fan out across the tobacco towns of Eastern North Carolina. The first NRB vote occurred in Rocky Mount, North Carolina on September 5th, 1946 at the China American Tobacco Plant, the largest of 10 leaf house factories in Rocky Mount, which was the center of the Eastern North Carolina tobacco belt. Black workers at China American who could not vote in a regular general election voted in this election overwhelmingly for the FTA. This decisive victory propelled the FTA into election victories at 24 more plants across the region by the 1st of November. The AFL union won 2 of the elections, a total of 27 elections in less than 2 months. This campaign organized 10,000 Black workers in Eastern North Carolina, a major blow to Jim Crow. FTA negotiated contracts that raised wages, reduced work hours to 8-hour days, created grievance procedures to address the very abusive white managers, which was a big factor in this campaign. The abuse that white foremen gave to the Black women workers in these tobacco factories was a big issue. And also this ensured safe and clean break rooms. Workers reported that instead of sitting on a stack of tobacco to eat, we got a dining room. We got water coolers rather than a nail keg with water and a bean can to drink out of. The FTA also engaged these workers in voter registration drives challenging the denial of voting rights. Workers like John Peace at Export Leaf in Oxford, North Carolina said it wasn't just wages we wanted, but freedom. Athena Moses, who worked at the J.P. Taylor plant in Goldsboro, described the campaign as standing up for what we believe. A lot of us signed up for the union. We wanted some freedom. FDA President John Henderson remarked that this Southern campaign was more than an organizing campaign, quote, "It is a social revolution, capturing its political character." Barbara Griffith observed that Blacks in the South were highly politicized in the post-war period and ready to organize in a way white workers in the South were not. One key characteristic was that Black churches were a critical support base for the FTA and other Black-led CIO unions. On the other hand, white churches influenced by the corporate-sponsored evangelical movement, in some cases expelled church members who joined the union, according to historians Ken and Elizabeth Fones-Wolf. In July of 1947, the Conservative Congress passed the Taft-Hartley Law, restricting the National Labor Relations Act in ways to curtail union organizing and collective bargaining. I contend that Taft-Hartley was in part a reaction to the success of the Black workers organizing during Operation Dixie, which sent shockwaves through the Southern ruling class. North Carolina Congressman Herbert Bonner, who represented Eastern North Carolina, was a key sponsor of this bill in Congress. Operation Dixie is said to have lasted from 1946 to 1953. Clearly, two periods of Operation Dixie. January 1946 to July 1947 is the pre-Taft-Hartley period, and July 1947 to 53 is the post-Taft-Hartley. Corporate powers used Taft-Hartley to erect more barriers to organizing Southern workers, outlawing sit-down strikes, allowing states to pass right-to-work laws, invoking anti-communist affidavits, and precipitating splits in the CIO. Right-wing anti-communism and a split CIO led to a decertification vote at R.J. Reynolds in April 1950, where the FTA Local 22 lost by a very close vote. This loss undermined the national FTA and led to its demise. However, FTA Local 10, covering all the FTA members in Eastern North Carolina, in spite of losing the financial backing of Local 22, survived in various forms until the 1970s. To the extent that Operation Dixie focused on textiles, the TWA met its high watermark in the general strike of 1951, when 45,000 workers in TWA locals, half of the workers under TWA contract in the South at over 26 plants in Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina, walked out in April of 1951 for strike for higher wages. It would be a 5-week strike designed to raise wages of Southern textile workers. The strike was centered on Dan River Mills in Danville, with 2 locals of white workers and 1 local of black workers, considered the pace-setting textile company with unbreakable locals. However, the strike began to fail after several weeks. The company busted in strike breakers at higher pay rates, began to use violence against the strikers. The TBA's effort to use the general strike as a transformative event in 1951 proved too little too late and failed. This sealed the fate of Operation Dixie as a turning point for the CIO and the U.S. labor movement. Not until the Memphis sanitation workers strike of 1968 did civil rights and labor rights converge as a transforming event in organizing the South and opened a new era, which we are in today. There's some slides I want to share about the campaign, the tobacco campaign, if Ben can put them up right now. Okay, this is a map of North Carolina. You see the 10 cities from South Boston, Virginia, down to Lumberton, where these campaigns were carried out. It was really a whole movement, and it that's what it looked like. And I have to say, these towns in the center here historically were part of the Black Second Congressional District from the Reconstruction period. So there was a history of Black resistance in this area. Okay, go to the next slide, Ben. This is a list of the elections, the 27 elections held between September 5th and November 1st, 1946. They all voted for the Union. There was also a number of plants where the AFL Union negotiated contracts without an L&B election. Okay, next slide. Okay, here's some of the workers, the women workers at John American Stemming Tobacco. It was under oppressive conditions. And and here's the China American plant in Rocky Mount, where the first vote was held. They kicked off this 2-month campaign that swept across Eastern North Carolina. Okay, next slide. Here's some of the flyers from the campaign. Here's one to the China American workers calling on people to come out to the Ebenezer Baptist Church for a meeting prior to that election. And again, it's CIO, and to the right here is after this, they won the election at China American. You see, you have a big graphic here, a swell start, the CIO program, and that's projecting strength and projecting, again, you've got workers from other plants involved. Okay, you can go on the next slide, and you can see a scorecard. They were putting out flyers, keeping a scorecard of all the elections to get, so they would build on the momentum of these victories going throughout the whole campaign. And again, you have a meeting at in Goldsboro at St. Stephen's Church. Then over here in Rocky Mount, having a meeting at Mount Pisgah Presbyterian Church. And it's interesting over here in the upper right, you can listen on your radio. There's here Labor Speak, George Balzani, director of the CIO Southern Organizing Campaign, is speaking. But here's the thing, the same month that they had the first election at China American, there was a textile campaign in Rocky Mount at the Caramount Mills, and where TVA lost. And I haven't found no evidence that they ever worked together. There was no effort to bring these campaigns together. They were going on at the same time in Rocky Mount, but they were, you know, again, the racial orientation of the TVA organizers was such that they didn't work together, and that's a big loss. You go to the next one. Okay, now before we had the fruit of labor, we had the women from Local 22. These are some of the key leaders of the union, and they were here in this picture singing at a union convention. And from the right here, that's Velma Hopkins. Then Theodosia Simpson here was the one who really led the sit-down strike, and Miranda Smith is the next one, became one of the, and others. They were the leaders of this movement. And they had culture. They had culture. You know, and God's always telling us about culture. This was a movement that had culture. They had songs, and I also have something. I don't know if I saw that flyer. There was one of those flyers I had showed that they highlighted union music at the rally, and they had records with these songs, and they played them at the different rallies in Eastern North Carolina. Okay, you go on the next one. And here's one of the heroes of FTA North Carolina, Miranda Smith. She went from being a shop floor worker at R.J. Reynolds in 1943 to within 5 years became on the executive board of the FTA, first woman to be on a executive board of a national union. And also, she was the Southeast Regional Director of FTA. So she is a hero, and when her funeral, Paul Robeson spoke at her funeral. And she's the name we need to lift up, Miranda Smith. Okay. And the Phoenix Historical, again, you know, we started talking about Operation Dixie a failure. Well, what the Phoenix Historical Society did was highlight this election and this movement among the Black workers. And we got a state historical marker that's in Rocky Mount on Franklin Street. Operation Dixie, Black Leaf House workers in Eastern North Carolina unionized in 1946. First pro-union vote at Tobacco Factory, 1 block west, precursor to the Civil Rights Movement. So we've tried to scoop this up as a victory. So as far as Black workers, it was a success, not a failure. So some of the lesson is the central role of Black workers in the movement. And you might say by some accounts, how Operation Dixie seems a failure because it failed with white workers, is leaving out the part that it's to see with Black workers. So, you know, again, we're trying to lift up the central role of Black workers in our movement in the South. You can't have a workers movement in the South without Black workers taking the lead. So that's my presentation. And I think it's about 7:40, so I think I'm right on time.
And thank you for that, Jim. Thank you for the history on the CIO and the Taft-Hartley. So we're gonna jump it back to Ed Bruno.
All right.
And he's
So
gonna speak for a few minutes.
go back to 1936, 1937 for a minute, coming out of 1946, 47. There's a couple things here that are worth noting, not the least of which is smaller sweeps are possible. Smaller organizing sweeps are possible. Not all of the 5 elements have to be present at the same time. Often they will not be, but you have to make up for that. So for example, you'll find, as Jim laid out, the big target of organizing the big textile mills and failed. However, the election And the election only sort of strategy that was used for those mills also failed. But when you had the union effort that was based on pre-existing cadre, on struggle in the workplace, and most importantly, out of the workplace, that challenged the Jim Crow era, that held out the promise for a class-wide better life, we saw success. And it was true on all the marginal areas of the South, including, the second longest sit-down strike in the United States was led by the UE. It's in St. Louis, which was a segregated border city, almost a southern city. So that the record is that the smallest sweeps, where they included the elements that made the big sweep for the CIO, actually had some success. And that's for us today. So leave 36 and 37 and come back to 2024. We still operate under the same election rules that the CIO couldn't win the elections in the big textile plants. So we need to look at our own circumstances and make a strategy accordingly, partly infused by what we learned from Operation Dixie, partly infused by what we learned from the CIO upsurge, and adapted to where we find ourselves today. And there's several things you can say, but the key question here is smaller scale sweeps, which are still meaningful, can be planned and won. And I want to just tell you a quick story. Again, this is one of these stories that you could take all night with. Story is about the National Nurses Organizing Committee. In 2004, the California nurses voted to raise their dues to fund an effort to organize hospital nurses nationwide. And that we named the National Nurses Organizing Committee. It was named that way intentionally. It was meant to be national in scope, although based in the big southern states. And it was meant to be an organizing committee. It was not meant to be a union going out of the gate. It was a network where what was envisioned is that we would have nurses from all kinds of hospitals all over the South united together in a network, which would be the NNOC. And that perhaps would result in some sort of organizing suite. At that time, the terrain, particularly in the South, was almost no hospital nurse unions at all. None in Texas, none in Georgia, none in North Carolina, a smattering in Florida. 6 years later, 2010, NNOC brought into the union 18 hospitals in 5 southern and southwestern states. So what happened there between 2004 and 2010? A couple things, and I'm only going to mention 2 or 3 of them, and then we'll move on to comment and questions. The recruiting for the NNOC was not based on wanting to have a union. In fact, very rarely did we talk about having a union. The recruitment was based on moving into action over the top issues at work in the hospital, which fundamentally for nurses was understaffing and low pay. So that we were recruiting an activist layer that wanted to do something right now, and not recruiting the people to join a union and eventually having an election. And NNOC intentionally was not a single facility operation, so that there was no meetings for just one hospital or one cadre in one hospital. All the meetings were network meetings. They were either citywide or statewide, but it was always NNOC Florida, NNOC Texas, NNOC Kansas, wherever we were, so that it was in people's consciousness that success comes by being tied together, not by having an isolated election in one place or another place. From the very beginning of the effort, after the initial recruiting of nurses, there was a expectation, if not a requirement, that every meeting had a public action. So that it wasn't a question of being secret. It was just the opposite. It was a question of being very public and taking the issue in the workplace and pulling it out of the workplace where you are most at risk in the workplace and most vulnerable, where the boss has most of the power, and bringing the issue of staffing and pay, which was really defined as safe patient care, into the public arena, and actually being much safer in many ways in that arena than we would have been inside the hospital local management. The point here was to get attention of the corporate officials. We didn't care really about the local hospital administration because the NNOC was after bigger game than a hospital or two. It was attempting to organize a sufficient number of hospitals to have a sufficient leverage on the industry to make a difference, particularly in the question of negotiating contracts that would be acceptable and change conditions for the better for the members. So at some point, that objective of being a sufficient amount of trouble in sufficient numbers of hospitals gained the attention of the corporate powers to be in a variety of corporate chains. These were almost all for-profit hospitals. And the question then became of how to run Taft-Hartley labor board elections, which is always a very difficult question. The key question here that I want to leave you with is if you can get as far along the line of actually having the potential for a sweep, it is very crucial, two things: group the labor board elections together in time. Hard to win them that way, but the resulting, assuming you can win, the resulting bargaining is how you want to set up. In other words, that put all 18 hospitals bargaining with their managements all at the same time. Allowed us then to have a corporate sort of coordinated campaign in all the states. So even though everybody was meeting in separate bargaining tables, we were able to coordinate, win first contracts at all the locations in 2012, second contract in 2015, and actually form a functioning union. One of the lessons to always remember here is when you can organize a sweep of multiple places, the object is not the election. The election is just the ticket to the dance. The dance is bargaining the contract. So that anytime you're planning a campaign, that plan has to go to, how do we win this contract? What kind of level of activity do we have to sustain in the workplaces? And what kind of public support do we have to sustain to be able to win contracts that are sufficient for our needs and ratified by our members? So if you take nothing else away from tonight, take this away: that small sweeps, if you start from the very beginning of organizing the elements that are required for a sweep, small sweeps, even under the Taft-Hartley Act, are possible and have been done. They were done in Operation Dixie back how many years ago that is, and they were done now. The current NNOC Southern region is now 32 hospitals. So it was the 18 original sweeps, and then it was a series of smaller sweeps. And the Southern region actually ranges from Wichita, Kansas, to Tucson, Arizona, to New Orleans, to North Carolina, and to Texas and Florida. And it's fundamentally based on the two biggest states in the South, Florida and Texas. So take heart, learn the lessons, apply them in your situation, but think big. Don't think little. Little always loses. Think big, think broad. Okay, Sharon.